I mean, what I know of contemporary Islamic banking is that it's no different than a conventional bank. It just has a different name. There's nothing in Islam that endorses degrading women because they're women, right? Indonesia itself has an interesting history of Islamic education. It's maybe different than in Central Asia and the Ottoman Empire. And in some respects, it might be better suited to modernity. But what happens is that when they do get some sort of power, they realize that the historical fiqh isn't really practical. And so then they're stuck. They don't know what to do. It's a very tragic situation when a Muslim government, in the name of Islam, prohibits women from learning or from contributing to Muslim society.
How do you understand with my...
Yes, okay. I think your question is whether Islamic commercial law has a role to play in the modern Muslim economy, basically. And that whether the practice of contemporary Islamic finance and Islamic banks can be considered a successful adaptation or a failed adaptation. So, I mean, I've written a little bit about this. In general, I have been fairly critical of Islamic finance and Islamic banking for some of the same reasons as this Pakistani economist that you mentioned, that for the most part, Islamic banks simply mimic conventional banks and do the same underlying economic transactions, but use a set of different contracts that they call Islamic contracts that are really what fuqaha would say are hila, right, to circumvent prohibition. So my approach would be to be based on maqasid. And I would try to argue that Islamic law permits both for-profit finance and not-for-profit finance. So the asl for-profit finance is bay'u Salaam, bay' li-thaman ajil. These are both commercial profit-seeking contracts that include an element of finance in them. But on the other hand, you have contracts that are purely charitable, like qard. So it's an error. Like I would say that Islamic economics made an error when it said the only kind of finance permissible in Islam is charitable financing. That's a mistake, because in fact, fiqh has both. And so what we should do in the modern world is bifurcate the for-profit sector from the not-for-profit sector. So what I would say that a country like Indonesia, Malaysia, any modern Muslim country should set up two different kinds of banking systems. One for the for-profit corporate sector, in which you just have the conventional banking system, and then you have a cooperative, not-for-profit banking sector for ordinary consumers. We know how to do both. There are models of for-profit banking, and there are models for not-for-profit banking. We don't have to invent the wheel. They already exist. We just have to sort of implement them, right? Now, in that case, we could still have a role for Islamic fiqh to play a role, because there's the qa'da ad-darura tuqaddar biqadariha. Just because somebody like me would say there's a necessity to allow a certain form of sort of interest-based lending in the commercial sector, that doesn't mean that everything becomes permitted. You only permit it to the extent required to have a functioning market economy, right? So you still would have to have public regulation of the for-profit banking sector, right? Likewise, you'd have to have regulation of the not-for-profit banking sector. And there you could use principles from fiqh to help you establish regulatory priorities, principles, etc., etc., etc. But What we've done kind of is the worst of both worlds in that we're trying to force conventional banking into the categories of fiqh. And so we're replicating all the worst aspects of conventional banking and not benefiting from the best parts of traditional fiqh. But if we took a more direct maqasidi approach, I think we could take the best of conventional banking and the best of fiqh to have a more efficient financial sector.
Oke, kasih ada follow up, Mas Mulis.
So, do you agree with Islamic banking state with their product?
I mean, what I know of contemporary Islamic banking is that it's no different than a conventional bank. It just has a different name.
Just different banks. That's why withdraw from the SE.
But if it makes people happy, I'm all for making people happy.
Oke, itu tadi tentang about Islamic economy today, which seems to be initially considered as successful story of Islamic economy, adaptation of Islamic fiqh to modern world, but in fact there are some issues as well there.
Thank you for your question. I'm very honored that you read a paper of mine. The basic, maybe it'll clear things up if I talked a little bit about what that paper was trying to do. What that paper was trying to do was reconcile the problem of gender equality and democracy in the Muslim world. Because oftentimes the two are set as enemies. The assumption being that if you have the more democracy you have in the Muslim world, the less gender equality you will have. And the more gender equality you have, the less democracy that you have, because the assumption is that Muslims don't value gender equality, right? And so in order to promote gender equality, you have to suppress Muslims. And so I was saying that that itself is a colonial logic, and it needs to be resisted. And that Muslims need to develop a way of promoting both gender equality and democracy. And so I was suggesting that we can glean from the Quran and the fiqh generally an anti-subordination ethic. Al-mu'min la yudhil nafsahu. That Islam is against debasing other people, whether they're a man or a woman. And that there's nothing in Islam that endorses degrading women because they're women, right? And that this is a very important principle of fiqh. It's not just something that Muhammad Fadel made up. It's a qa'ada in fiqh. Al-mu'min la yudhil nafsahu. And that we can use this principle as a principle of ijtihad to try to make changes to our fiqh in accordance with what's possible in the modern world, to reduce subordination. Because obviously subordination can't be something that the Sharia intends. It's something that's incidental. Yes, right? It arises, but not because the Sharia intends it. The Sharia would like to get rid of it if it can, right? So, there was a hadith that Fatima complained to the Prophet ﷺ that she was, she found housework very burdensome and that she wanted a servant, etc. And then the Prophet ﷺ taught her a dua instead. Now, are we supposed to learn from that women shouldn't complain about housework? No. But the Prophet didn't have a machine to give her, right? But if we have machines to do work in the house and women can do other things, that should be good. We should be happy about that, right? Because it's degrading to spend all your time grinding grain on stone and all this other stuff, right? So what's necessary when I say is perform ground up is so that it's consistent with our capacity as self-governing citizens. Because dictatorship is degrading. It's degrading to have no voice in the rules that govern you, right? So that's the general background to the paper, that we need to have strategies of gender equality that are consistent with self-government. Because to say gender equality justifies despotism and justifies dictatorship, that's just another form of degradation and humiliation, right? Just like gender discrimination can be a form of humiliation, dictatorship can also be a form of humiliation. So we want to get rid of all of it across the board. Now, I don't want to comment on any particular countries. Every country in the world needs to improve the position of their women across the board. Everywhere, including Canada, including the United States, including Saudi Arabia, including Indonesia, right? But it's not just women, because the modern world is full of situations where people are degraded. So we should be offended by conditions that degrade human beings, as Muslims at least. Right? As Muslims, we believe God created us to be khulafa. So how can we accept the fact that a creature that God has created to be elevated is degraded? That should be offensive to us as Muslims. I hope I'm not sure if that's a good answer to you, right? But I can't answer, you need specific scenarios. Is Saudi Arabia a good idea to chair the Council on Gender Equality? Whatever. I mean, it's international politics, and so every country gets its turn, right? So there might be good reasons for Saudi Arabia to get its role. And that might be an incentive for Saudi Arabia to take more seriously these obligations. I don't know. I don't want to get into all of that. But I want to emphasize that degradation of human beings is offensive to Islam. Whether they're men, women, brown, white, black, red, we should collectively work on relieving people of humiliation and dignifying them. That's what the ultimate ethic of Islam is.
Terima kasih Pak Naim atas pertanyaan dan juga Prof. Fadel atas jawabannya. Ada lagi yang mau share knowledge atau pertanyaan? Our incoming student from Philippines, Pak Melvin Jabar, and the second one, Mas Elim, you want to ask questions? Okay, two more.
I'm interested in the topics of the Muslim world, because I'm Philippines and I'm Catholic. When sociologists develop secularization theory and secularism as an ideology, the internet technology and its associated technologies were not existing. But now it's a way of life of young people. And do you think this will erode religion or lower the level of religiosity of young Muslim people in the Muslim world?
Well, I think, first of all, in order to live successfully in the modern world, one has to acquire a domain, a range of knowledge and expertise across a wide area of things that was kind of inconceivable 200 years ago. So that in of itself is a problem for religion. Because whereas before, education was religious education, as a practical matter, just to survive, you have to engage in secular education. There's not really a choice. You have to. Everybody has to. And so, whether or not secularization results in decreased relevance of religion or adherence to religion, that's ultimately a question of how religion responds to this. And part of what I'm trying to say here is that modern religious education in the context of Islam has to be different than pre-modern education. So the pre-modern educational system, now I know that Indonesia itself has an interesting history of Islamic education. It's maybe different than in Central Asia and the Ottoman Empire. And in some respects, it might be better suited to modernity. Because my understanding is the Sufi tariqas that came here and spread Islam intentionally try to simplify Islam. And so the texts that they taught were intentionally relatively simple texts compared to in the Islamic West. And, and I think that's actually the only approach that makes sense in the modern world. Because you don't have time to spend 25 years mastering the curriculum that you find in traditional Islamic seminaries in places like, as they had developed in the Middle Ages in the Islamic West, right? And so a modern Islamic religious education has to be much more streamlined. It has to be focused on much more fundamental elements of religion, along with what I call sort of the critical apparatus of religion. That way, you still have time to learn everything you need in your secular life. So if you can achieve that, then I see no reason why religion would recede in importance. Right? I mean, religion is part of public life in Indonesia, it's part of public life in Egypt, etc. And I don't think that it's necessary for it to disappear in any sort of way, as long as religious education adapts to what is possible to be taught to people.
Thank you. Okay, Ellen first, and Osman, you can ask a question as well.
Thank you. I want to react of your topic about secularism and Islamism. When we talk about secularism, I want to see visionary to the future. We know in this couple of years, we saw that in many countries, Islam is rise. In Australia, in Europe, in America, many people convert to Islam because of the Palestine war, etc. And make Islam is not just as a religion, but also ideological spirit. But I think that movement need more academically formulated, because we know that when secularism rise in Europe, came to Turkey, secularism had a formula, and now I think Islamism that rise is need to be academically formulated too. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times, historically, a lot of Islamist movements have thought that the aim of Islamic politics should be applying the Sharia, say tatbiq al-Sharia, right? That's their answer. If you ask them, what do you want to do if you become in power? We want to say, we want to apply the Sharia, right? Now, as a practical matter, that can only mean the historical fiqh. But what happens is that when they do get some sort of power, they realize that the historical fiqh isn't really practical. And so then they're stuck. They don't know what to do. Right? It creates a crisis. And so that's why I was suggesting that in my lecture that the real contribution that Islam has to make to modern governance is producing the kinds of citizens that are capable of engaging in democratic self-government. Because if you don't have a critical mass of civically minded, virtuous citizens, democracy can be catastrophic. And so the crucial role that Islam has to play, so yes, al-Islam huwa al-hal, that was a common slogan of Islamist parties. But how is it a solution? It's a solution by Islam's role as a moral teacher of the people, right? By teaching people how to orient themselves properly toward God and how to orient themselves properly toward their fellow human being. It's not a solution to tell you whether you should invest greater resources in solar energy or wind energy or coal. It's just not going to help you there, right? It's not going to help you determine how many years of obligatory primary education you need. It's not going to help you determine, what the optimal size of a lot of property is in the new city you're developing. All these kinds of practical problems that you face as a government when you're in power, right? So that's kind of my view on Islamism as a political movement. That yes, Islam has a very important role to play because it's fundamental, I think, to the moral instruction of the people. And it can do that very well if teachers of Islam focus on that, as opposed to trying to say that Islam has particular solutions for the particular problems of modernity.
Okay. Makasih.
She had a question.
Yeah. Can you introduce yourself first and then ask your question?
Hello everybody, I'm Salaam from Afghanistan. So I appreciate Professor, your words were very clear. So I have one question. As my question, if get education is very important in Islam, my some country girl and woman they can't get education or work outside from home. So they will live under Islamic governance. So why they can't get education?
Yeah, it's a very tragic situation when a Muslim government, in the name of Islam, prohibits women from learning or from contributing to Muslim society. I mean, that's all I can say, right? And I think that's, this is what I was trying to say in response to the previous question, that because of the narrowness of the view of many Muslims toward what Islamic governance means, that as soon as they get power, what they think they have to do is apply rules of fiqh. And these rules of fiqh were maybe appropriate for a completely different society, but not at all appropriate for today or the possibilities of today, right? We bleed for Afghanistan. Afghanistan has had war for 70 years. My entire lifetime it's been in war. And so we hope that it attains peace. And if it attains peace and prosperity, it's not going to be able to imprison women. It's not logical. It's not, and so I pray that God gives them guidance to stop oppressing their sisters, right? And to do so in the name of Islam makes it even more painful. But yes, if you go look in fiqh books, they will say that, a woman, the Prophet ﷺ said, men work outside the house, women work inside the house. That's how they interpreted things, right? And they view that as an obligation that God decreed, right? But it doesn't seem to be something that is of the same status as Tawheed. Let me just put it that way. It seems to be a very speculative opinion. It might have made sense 500 years ago. Nobody ever questioned it, right? But today we can see that that's a very limited view of human society and the potential of women, etc. And so I hope that things improve.
You're from Afghanistan? Right, yeah. So hopefully it's getting better when you come back to Afghanistan next time, reform and change Afghanistan as well. Alright, anyone to give a question for the class? If not,